Now we're going to stay with the US election. Many in Europe are, of course, closely watching events unfold across the Atlantic to see what the results will mean for the continent's relationship with Washington, particularly after 4 years of what's been fiery exchanges on trade and international policy. Steel producers, winemakers and olive growers are all impacted by the vote, which could mean more damaging tariff wars or a shift towards less confrontational negotiations. At the same time, international observers are looking out for changes to America's commitments towards environmental goals. Well, let's get a little bit more perspective from Europe on this and head over to Brussels to speak to our correspondent, Shona Murray. Shona, morning to you. Of course it matters to Europe who's sitting at the helm of the White House, but particularly just talk us through why it's important from the perspective of the economy.
Well, I suppose, first of all, Rosie, if you look at how Donald Trump has disrupted global trade, really criticising the WTO, walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which strengthens China, threatening EU companies that trade with Iran as a legitimate part of the JCPOA. Whereas, the EU, on the other hand, is the poster boy for free trade, has, completed several free trade agreements with Japan, signed off on one with Mercosur over the past 4 years. So I think that's a real concern in terms of economics and the security of economics and global free trade. And I think from an EU point of view, they see Trump as someone who's emboldened others who would like to disrupt the European Union, like Putin, but even closer to home, like Orban and like the Polish government. But I caught up with John Bruton, who's the former EU ambassador to the United States, and I asked him about this economic and trade conflict between the two sides.
And he has emboldened some people. It's ironic in a way that he seems to get on well with the government in Poland and with the government in Moscow, even though they're very hostile to one another. And what they have in common is a sort of a nostalgic approach to politics, wanting to go back to the old glories of the nation state rather than working together in a multilateral frame of mind. So I think President Trump would not be good for Europe. I think President Biden would be better for Europe. And if Europe had a vote, which it doesn't, I think they would be voting for Vice President Biden.
Shona, if we look back over the last 4 years of relationships, what will be the legacy of Trump's first mandate for EU-US relations?
Well, I think there's quite a long sort of plethora of issues, and not any of them really have been quite positive. If you look at the rhetoric coming from Donald Trump, even as far back as early 2016, 2015, when he was campaigning, he's been a Eurosceptic. He was supportive of Brexit. He's been critical personally about Angela Merkel. He's supported Europe's enemies like, I suppose, Russia, but other enemies further afield, or people at least who would be in conflict with Europe over major issues around global warming, like Duterte, like also Bolsonaro. So there's a real conflict between the two sides. I think the policy of Donald Trump is interesting as well, because he is against multilateralism. He's more transactional. It's a zero-sum game policy with him. His America First policy does not coincide with the EU's priorities of multilateralism. And then if you look at some of the things that he's done, walking away from the Paris Climate Accord at a time when the EU says it should be more ambitious and be climate neutral by 2050. But take a listen to how John Bruton summarises it.
The first big shock was when President Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord on climate change. We all recognise that it's only by all countries working together that we can deal with the threat of climate change. I think also he hurt the United States by withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a partnership in the Pacific around trade that enabled the US to maintain its economic influence in that area. And I think that was a mistake on his part. And then thirdly, I think the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. I think that was very threatening, because we got to a point where Iran was under some discipline. And now, as a result of that action, it's under no discipline. I also think in a general sense, and this is probably illustrated by the fact that Nigel Farage was at one of Mr. Trump's recent rallies, Mr. Trump is hostile to the European Union as an idea. And I think that's troubling for most Europeans.
So that's former EU Ambassador to the United States, John Bruton, making the point that Donald Trump really over the past 4 years has rolled back on the multilateral successes like the Iran deal, but also really crucial issues around global warming and climate change. And I think if I was to sort of summarise it here from Brussels, the feeling is that this is the most important election globally in a lifetime, and people in Europe don't have the ability to vote, and they definitely would like to do so. Rosie?
Shona, thank you very much, our correspondent in Brussels.